What began as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the small town of Millbrook would soon become the day that forever changed Sarah Coleman's life and exposed a shocking truth about justice and power. At 34, Sarah navigated the familiar streets in her motorized wheelchair, a routine she had perfected over the past 8 years since the accident that had changed everything. The sun filtered through the golden autumn leaves, casting dancing shadows on the asphalt as she headed downtown to take care of urgent banking matters. Few passers-by paid attention to the determined woman moving purposefully along the sidewalks, unaware that within hours she would be at the center of an event that would shake the entire community. The independence Sarah had built wasn't a gift. It had been a daily battle, fought with ironclad determination against a world that often underestimated her abilities. After a drunk driver shattered her spinal cord and her dreams of becoming a professional marathon runner, she had to rebuild not just her physical life, but her entire identity. Every calculated movement of her wheelchair represented months of physical therapy. Every simple daily task had been relearned with infinite patience and a willpower that impressed even the most experienced doctors. What no one knew was that her greatest test of resilience was still ahead, and it would come from a source meant to protect her. Marcus Coleman glanced at the clock in his temporary office on the construction site, knowing that in just a few hours he would be home with Sarah, sharing stories about their day as they made dinner together, just as they did every night. At 38, the veteran had found in their domestic routine a peace the battlefields of Afghanistan had never provided, and Sarah was the anchor that kept him grounded after years drifting through traumatic war memories. His co-workers respected his quiet dedication and his unmatched ability to resolve conflicts, but none of them suspected the extraordinary past Marcus kept hidden like a state secret. The medals, tucked away in a box in the attic, told a story he preferred to keep buried, unaware that soon he would be forced to dig it back up. The couple had built a simple but deeply meaningful life in Millbrook, far from the blinding lights and chaos of the big cities where their former lives had been lived under constant pressure. Sarah worked as an online consultant for companies seeking to become more inclusive for people with disabilities, while Marcus applied his leadership skills to construction projects that helped revitalize the local community. They were known in the neighborhood as the couple always willing to help, who took part in community events and had turned their own adversity into a source of inspiration for others. But no one could foresee that this impeccable reputation would be tested in a way neither of them could have imagined. The parking lot of the First National Bank seemed like a safe and familiar place as Sarah maneuvered her wheelchair between the parked cars, but fate had other plans for that seemingly peaceful afternoon. Her adapted vehicle, a Honda Pilot modified with hand controls and an automatic ramp, had begun to suffer from intermittent electrical issues that occasionally left her trapped inside the car. The cruel irony of having her hard-won independence threatened by a mechanical failure was not lost on Sarah, who had fought for years to reclaim her autonomy after the accident that had forever altered her life. As she repeatedly pressed the ramp button that refused to respond, a sense of vulnerability began to creep in, like the universe had conspired to remind her of her fragility at the worst possible moment. The mechanical clicks of the jam system echoed across the quiet parking lot, creating a soundtrack of frustration that drew curious glances from passing drivers, none of whom offered help. Sarah tried to stay calm as she checked the fuses and rebooted the electrical system, troubleshooting steps she had learned out of necessity after years of relying on temperamental assistive technology. Sweat beaded on her forehead, not just from the physical strain, but from the rising anxiety of being trapped in public, exposed and vulnerable in a way that awakened her worst nightmares about dependence. Every minute that passed without a solution deepened her helplessness, and she couldn't shake the disturbing feeling that someone was watching her with intentions that went far beyond simple curiosity. The call to Marcus was instinctive, a conditioned reflex she had developed for moments that pushed the limits of her hard-earned independence. Her voice remained steady as she explained the situation, but Marcus, trained to detect subtle cues under pressure, immediately sensed the tension Sarah was trying to hide. "I'm on my way, love. Stay in the car and lock the doors until I get there," he said, already grabbing his keys and telling his supervisor he had a family emergency to handle. The protective tone in his voice sparked a mix of gratitude and frustration in Sarah. She loved having someone who cared so deeply for her, but hated feeling like a damsel in distress, needing to be rescued from situations she should be able to handle alone. While she waited for Marcus to arrive, Sarah noticed a police car making a slow round through the parking lot, and for a moment she felt genuine relief, thinking the officer might offer assistance, or at least ensure her safety while she waited. The vehicle stopped a few spaces ahead, and through her rearview mirror she could see the officer watching her with an intensity that made her question whether his presence was truly a blessing or something entirely different. The sensation of being assessed, judged, and catalogued by a uniformed stranger triggered a primal unease she couldn't explain, as if her instincts were trying to warn her of a danger her rational mind hadn't yet processed. Officer Daniel Reeves stepped out of his cruiser with the arrogant confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged in his 8-year career. But something about Sarah's posture triggered in him an inexplicable hostility he couldn't quite understand himself. His heavy boots echoed against the asphalt as he approached the adapted vehicle, his sunglasses catching the afternoon sun in a way that turned his face into an impenetrable mask of questionable authority. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized he wasn't approaching to offer help, but rather with the rigid, suspicious stance of someone who had already decided she was some kind of problem to be investigated. The way he rested his hand near his restraint gear sent a cold shiver down her spine, and she began to understand that her peaceful afternoon was about to take a dark turn. "Ma'am, I need to see your license and vehicle registration immediately," Reeves demanded, his authoritative tone leaving no room for questions, even before explaining what crime she was supposedly committing by simply trying to exit her own car. Confused but cooperative, Sarah began searching for her documents in her bag, politely explaining that she was just having technical issues with her vehicle's accessibility ramp. Reeves's expression, however, remained skeptical and hostile, as if every word she spoke was part of an elaborate lie meant to deceive him in a way only he could see. "A lot of people fake disabilities to get benefits and privileges they don't deserve," he muttered, as he scrutinized her paperwork with exaggerated suspicion, planting the seeds of a confrontation that was about to spiral completely out of control. Reeves's relentless questioning of the legitimacy of her disability hit Sarah like a punch to the gut, resurfacing years of trauma tied to the subtle discrimination she had endured since the accident. "You don't look as disabled as you claim to be," he stated with barely disguised contempt, demanding that she prove her condition in a way that violated not only her dignity but also her basic legal protections. Sarah tried to remain composed as she explained her rights and the nature of her spinal cord injury, but each word seemed only to fuel the officer's growing hostility. He interpreted her clarity and intelligence as evidence she was trying to manipulate him. What had started as a call for help had now devolved into a humiliating interrogation, leaving Sarah wondering if this was a nightmare, or if there really were people in the world with so much power and so little compassion. The moment Reeves ordered Sarah to get out of her wheelchair to prove her disability marked the point where tension turned into something far more dangerous and potentially violent. "A lot of scammers use wheelchairs as props to trick the system," he insisted, completely disregarding the medical and legal explanations Sarah presented with increasing desperation. Her polite but firm refusal to submit to such public humiliation was seen by Reeves as defiance, and the expression on his face shifted from suspicion to something darker and more threatening. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was trapped between her locked wheelchair and a police officer who had apparently decided she was guilty of some imagined offense, and there were no nearby witnesses close enough to intervene if things escalated further. What happened next would be captured on video by 3 different cell phone cameras, but no recording could fully convey the shock and horror of the moment Officer Reeves chose to use physical force against a defenseless woman in a wheelchair. "I've had enough of this act," he growled as he suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm and tried to force her upright, completely ignoring her cries of pain and desperate protests that her paralysis was real and permanent. The sound of impact as Sarah was thrown from her chair echoed through the parking lot like a gunshot, followed by a deadly silence that seemed to suspend time as onlookers processed the sheer brutality they had just witnessed. Sarah lay on the scorching asphalt, her carefully maintained dignity shattered, along with her sense of safety in a world she had fought so hard to navigate independently. The pain radiating through her body was nothing compared to the psychological trauma of being physically assaulted by someone sworn to protect citizens like her. Tears of rage mixed with humiliation streamed down her face as she struggled to comprehend how her simple afternoon had devolved into this nightmare. Reeves stood over her with a mix of satisfaction and growing panic as he began to realize his actions had been witnessed and recorded. But his pride prevented him from acknowledging the magnitude of his mistake or offering any help to the woman he had just brutalized without a single legitimate reason. The footage captured by shaky cell phone hands trembled with the shock of the spectators, but none of them dared to step forward and offer direct help, frozen by the intimidating presence of the officer who had clearly lost control of the situation. Sarah remained on the hot asphalt, her wheelchair toppled several feet away, a cruel symbol of her vulnerability, as she struggled to mentally process the trauma of being assaulted by someone meant to represent protection and justice. The heavy silence was broken only by nervous whispers and the distant hum of traffic, creating a surreal atmosphere where time seemed to pause to witness an injustice no one knew how to confront without risking becoming the next victim. Reeves, now aware he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from, especially with multiple cameras recording every second of his criminal behavior, was overtaken by growing panic. Yet his wounded pride and years of unchecked authority prevented him from admitting fault or offering any assistance to the woman he had just brutally assaulted. Instead, he began to spin pathetic justifications for his actions, claiming that Sarah had resisted arrest and posed a threat to his safety, statements that sounded absurd even to his own ears, but which represented his only hope of escaping the consequences of his inexcusable brutality. With hands trembling from pain and adrenaline, Sarah managed to reach her cell phone, which had fallen during the assault, her fingers struggling against the cracked screen as she dialed Marcus's number with a desperation beyond any emergency they had ever faced together. "Marcus, I need you now," she whispered through a broken voice, trying to stay composed as she quickly explained the situation. Careful not to cause full-blown panic in her husband, knowing his reaction could determine how the next few minutes unfolded. On the other end of the line, Marcus felt his blood run cold at the sound of that desperate tone, one he recognized from the battlefield when wounded soldiers called for help. And in that moment, he knew something terrible had happened to the most important person in his life. His voice changed instantly, shifting from the tender concern of a loving husband to something colder, sharper, and far more calculated. It was a voice Sarah had rarely heard, a voice that belonged to the elite soldier he once was, long before he became the gentleman she knew and loved. "Secure yourself. Identify any ongoing threat. Don't make sudden movements." "I'm on my way," he instructed with military precision, already sprinting toward his truck, his mind processing tactics and scenarios as if lives depended on his next move. Because now, one did. The roar of an engine approaching caused everyone in the parking lot to turn their heads, but nothing could have prepared them for what emerged from the black Ford F-150 that came to a surgical stop just a few feet from Sarah. Marcus Coleman stepped out of the vehicle with the unmistakable posture of a man used to taking command in life-or-death situations. But when he fully turned to face Officer Reeves, the officer's expression shifted from defensive arrogance to utter shock and rising fear. "General Coleman," Reeves murmured, his voice trembling as he instantly recognized the man who had made national headlines just 2 years earlier for leading the most daring rescue operation of the decade in the Middle East. Sarah looked up at her husband with a mix of confusion and awe, realizing that even after years of marriage, there were still layers to Marcus she hadn't fully uncovered. Secrets kept not out of deceit, but from a humility that refused to boast about extraordinary accomplishments. The dynamic in the parking lot shifted in an instant, as if someone had flipped an invisible switch, completely altering the power balance that had ruled the last 20 minutes. Marcus didn't need to say a word as he knelt beside Sarah, his trained hands assessing her injuries with the calm efficiency of someone who had administered battlefield triage, but his eyes never left Reeves, locking onto him with such intensity that the officer involuntarily stepped back. The heavy silence finally broke when Marcus spoke, his voice carrying decades of unquestionable authority and a fury so tightly restrained it was more terrifying than any explosion of rage could have been. "Officer, you just physically assaulted my wife, a disabled civilian veteran, without provocation or legal justification, in front of multiple witnesses and cameras." The recognition of Marcus's true identity spread through the crowd like wildfire, transforming what had been a group of passive onlookers into an energized gathering that now understood they were witnessing a confrontation between a decorated war hero and a police officer who had made a catastrophic mistake. Reeves tried to regain some control of the situation, but his words came out jumbled and incoherent as he faced the piercing gaze of a man who had faced international terrorists and led missions that saved hundreds of American lives. Marcus helped Sarah sit up against their vehicle with the precise care of a trained medic, each movement calculated to protect her safety and dignity. At the same time, he subtly positioned himself to dominate Reeves's field of vision and block any potential escape routes, applying military containment tactics so smoothly that the officer didn't even realize he was being strategically isolated. The arrival of additional patrol cars and an ambulance, quietly requested by Marcus through his military contacts, turned the scene into something straight out of an action film. But the reality was even more intense, because everyone present knew they were witnessing true justice being enacted by someone with the authority and credibility to ensure that consequences would be real and lasting. Reeves's supervisor, Captain Morrison, arrived already aware he was walking into a public relations crisis that could end careers and trigger federal investigations, especially upon learning that the victim was the wife of a highly decorated general with an immaculate reputation and connections reaching the highest levels of the U.S. government. The ensuing investigation uncovered a dark trail of misconduct, transforming Sarah's case from an isolated incident into a systematic expose of corruption that shook the Millbrook Police Department to its core. Internal records uncovered by federal investigators, prompted by discreet inquiries Marcus had made through Pentagon contacts, revealed that Reeves had racked up 17 complaints for excessive use of force over the past 3 years, all mysteriously dismissed or downplayed by supervisors who were now themselves under investigation for cover-ups. The most shocking discovery came when auditors found evidence that Reeves had deliberately targeted vulnerable citizens, seniors, people with disabilities and minorities, knowing they had fewer resources to fight back or be taken seriously by higher authorities. The justice system responded with a speed and resolve that surprised even Marcus, who had seen military bureaucracy in action many times. But this time, the crucial difference was that the victims had a defender whose reach extended all the way to the office of the United States Attorney General. Reeves was not only immediately dismissed from duty, he was also charged with federal civil rights violations under color of law, a crime that carried significant prison time and guaranteed he would never again work in law enforcement in any U.S. jurisdiction. What no one expected was that the traumatic incident would become the catalyst for a social revolution that extended far beyond Millbrook, igniting change that would reach the national stage of disability rights. Initially reluctant to become a public figure, Sarah soon discovered that her story had touched millions of Americans who faced quiet discrimination every day, and that her courage in confronting the system inspired a wave of similar reports across the country. Marcus used his influence and connections to launch the Coleman Foundation for Justice and Accessibility, an organization providing free legal support to victims of disability discrimination and mandatory civil rights training for police departments nationwide. The foundation quickly became a powerful political force, with Sarah as its president and Marcus as strategic advisor, turning their personal tragedy into a lifelong mission to protect thousands from experiencing similar injustice. The final and most unexpected moment came 6 months later, when Sarah and Marcus were invited to the White House for the signing of new federal legislation establishing national protocols for police interactions with individuals with disabilities. The law would be named the Sarah Coleman Act, and it became the lasting legacy of an afternoon that began with a simple trip to the bank. During the ceremony, Sarah realized her journey had come full circle, from the victim of brutal discrimination to a national civil rights advocate, proving that sometimes the darkest moments of our lives can be transformed into light that guides others through their own battles, and that true love not only sustains us through the storm, but empowers us to change the world.